In answer to her question, where did applied drama theatre come from, Helen Nicholson cites three areas of origin. She says, there are three interrelated theatre movements that have made significant contributions to 21st century applied drama. Theatres of the political left, which have been variously described as political, radical or alternative, drama and theatre in education, and community theatre. Now, while Bertolt Brecht is unequivocally included in the first category, and indeed subsequently cited by Nicholson, it's typical of current scholarship, I'd suggest, that he has to jostle for his position as one among the many who paved the way for the contemporary subdiscipline of applied theatre. It's my contention that this situation reflects a failure to appreciate the profound and seminal influence that Brecht's practice and theory has exerted upon the field. For instance, he merits no mention in Philip Taylor's Applied Theatre. This may be due in part to the ways in which the more recent theatre in education and community theatre movements, particularly the plethora of Boal and Boal-related publications, have obscured his influence, as well as the time it has taken for some of Brecht's works to be translated into English, though that's clearly no longer the case. There's been a recent splurge of Brecht, particularly from Methuen, of which these are some of the most recent. And again, also perhaps partly the reason why I'm thinking there's access to more material now in translation than there's ever been, and some of that material is likely to, I think, substantiate my thesis. And also the early and near fatal misrepresentation of a vital period of Brecht's output by the critic Martin Esslin, notably in Brecht, A Choice of Evils. The title is indicative of the failure of the book, but I won't go into that. That would be a big digression. Given the context of the Cold War, allied to the perception of Brecht as cultural emissary for the hardline East German government, it was hardly surprising that a crude ideological binary of capitalism versus communism prevented a more thoughtful analysis of the nuances of Brecht's Marxism as reflected in his aesthetic of epic realism. In more recent times, the distrust of any modernist master narrative, which characterizes postmodern criticism, has ensured that Brecht's association with Marxism continues to downgrade his influence upon contemporary theatrical practices, in particular those of applied theatre. My contention, however, is that it is the very importance of Marx's thought for Brecht's practice and theory which makes him the seminal influence upon applied theatre. One of Brecht's favourite passages of Marx comes from his 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Marx, this is, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Reflecting on his theatrical practice towards the end of his life, Brecht returned to this bedrock statement as a core principle and said, I wanted to take the principle that it was not just a matter of interpreting the world, but of changing it, and apply that to the theatre. Here, in its simplest form, is the fundamental credo of applied theatre, the application of theatre processes to the desire to change the world. There's no point in engaging in applied theatre unless you start from a premise that the world can be changed and that the means of making change lies in the agency of each one of us. The type of change to be sought will depend upon your current relationship to existing society, but the search for change is a common denominator for all, save the few who are anxious to preserve the status quo in their own interests, and therefore seek to persuade the rest that change is either undesirable or impossible. There is no alternative. Change is, however, a ubiquitous concept operating at every level of existence, from the most intimate psychological to the most far-reaching socio-political. Many practices that are labelled applied theatre confine themselves to the orbit of the psychosocial. They concern themselves with applying theatre processes to groups thought of as disadvantaged or marginalised, in order that the participants may, as a result of their experiences in workshops, be better or more comfortably fitted to taking a useful or productive place in the world as it currently exists. The notion of behaviour change often attaches itself to these practices. People are encouraged to feel better about themselves through confidence-building techniques closely akin to those offered in drama therapy, although of course we must never call it that. While there's no binary divide between the social and the psychological, but rather a dialectical process where change in one sphere may provoke change in the other, Brecht's theatre aesthetic was clearly directed towards social change, the world. His applied theatre concerns itself with making changes to socio-economic structures and relations so that it becomes in people's interest to change behaviour. This is why his plays depict changes of situation leading to changes in the way people act, rather than changes in characterisation producing changed situations. In a theatre of situations, the story is the central focus. Why has this particular story occurred? How might it be changed? What does it show us about how our world is organised? Applied theatre is a theatre of storytelling, and much of its aesthetic derives from Brecht's practices. In addition to the way in which theatre is made in order to be categorised as applied theatre, there is the issue of by whom and for whom this theatre is made. Brecht expressed his thoughts in his poem On Everyday Theatre, where he wrote, amongst a lot else, it's quite a long poem, "You artists who perform plays in great houses under electric suns before the hushed crowd, pay a visit sometime to that theatre whose setting is the street." Here Brecht took a pioneering role in establishing a particular kind of connection between the event being staged and those who formed the audience for it. As he said elsewhere, the bare wish, if nothing else, to evolve an art fit for the times must drive our theatre of the scientific age straight out into the suburbs, where it can stand, as it were, wide open at the disposal of those who live hard and produce much, so that they can be fruitfully entertained there with their great problems. Notwithstanding the modernist language in which the wish is couched, Brecht signals here the need of theatre applied to social change to seek audiences who have an investment in change, wherever they may be found. In contemporary jargon, this is applied theatre's performances for target audiences. As in applied theatre, Brecht's theatre does not produce social change, but merely provides the stimulus for audiences to debate change, which may or may not be enacted beyond the theatre event. Whatever happens subsequently, for the theatrical stimulus to be effective, the audience must be entertained. The next section is on the Lehrstücke. What is customary, let it astound you. After Brecht embarked on a serious study of Marx in 1926, he began to develop new theatrical forms for performance in both conventional theatres and non-theatrical spaces with actors and non-actors. He labelled the plays in question Lehrstücke. The translation is awkward because the word Lehr carries the combined force of learning and teaching, both of which activities figure prominently in these plays. In relation to future manifestations of applied theatre, the vital feature of several of these plays is that those who participate learn through their participation in them. In other words, Brecht introduces the core notion of theatre as education. He was working on several of these plays in 1929 and 1930 against a backdrop of economic chaos and political confusion. Street violence was commonplace in Berlin and other large cities, and the Nazis had begun to make gains in provincial governments. On the other side, sectarian differences between the socialist, SPD, and communist KPD parties were making the resistible rise of Adolf Hitler less easy to resist, with fatal consequences by the time of the elections in January 1933 that brought him to power. Given this context, it's unsurprising that some of the Lehrstücke foreground the importance of party discipline in overcoming the forces of capitalism and fascism, while others investigate dilemmas that occur after a society has adopted communism. It should be remembered that Marx had predicted that Germany would be the first country to adopt communism, and the USSR had stolen a march by leaping over several evolutionary phases in going almost overnight from feudalism to communism. As Rotswieser-Müller puts it, the historical basis for the Lehrstück is a society in transition to socialism. Within this context, the central concern is to find ways of learning that are adequate for the new state. The rapidly deteriorating economic circumstances after 1929 impacted on the cultural sphere, resulting in increasing difficulties, both financial and ideological, for Brecht in getting his plays into formal theatre spaces. His recasting of himself as a revolutionary artist with avowed communist sympathies, although typically he never joined the party, also meant that the traditional bourgeois theatre audiences were no longer the targets for his work. Consequent upon this mix of pragmatic and ideological factors, he sought new actors, new audiences, and new spaces, a precursor to the common practices of contemporary applied theatre. When Brecht and Hans Eisler withdrew the measures taken from the Berlin Festival of New Music in 1930, before the organisers could attempt to censor the script, Kurt Weill also withdrew his collaboration with Brecht, He Who Says Yes, in solidarity. This school opera was instead performed at the Berlin Central Institute for Teaching and Education by school children. Adapted from Arthur Waley's translation of the Noble Tannico, Brecht was drawn to the sparse, austere aesthetic as one way of realising a non-naturalistic epic form. In line with his recent study of Marxist-Leninist political thought, the chorus which frames the opera announces the ideological intention at the outset. What we must learn above all is consent. Many say yes, and yet there is no consent. Many are not asked, and many consent to wrong things. Therefore, what we must learn above all is consent. The story of the play concerns an expedition across the mountains in search of medical advice and aid. A young boy whose mother is sick insists upon joining the expedition, but when he cannot continue through exhaustion, he is subjected to the custom of consenting to being thrown into the valley in order that the expedition can proceed unencumbered. Brecht was attempting to show both the difficulty and the importance of consent as a core principle of communist discipline. The crux of the narrative is in the dialogue between the boy and his teacher, the teacher. Then you consent to being left behind? The boy. I will think about it. Pause for reflection. Yes, I consent. The intention was to use the play as a trigger for a discussion between performers and audience around the contradictions and paradoxes of consent. However, the response was overwhelmingly hostile, not just from predictable quarters, but also from the schoolchildren themselves and Brecht's allies such as Eisler, who was dismayed by the feudalism of the message. In response to these criticisms, Brecht wrote a counterplay, He Who Says No, where the boy, despite his initial agreement to the terms of travel, refuses his consent when the crisis strikes. The boy. As for the old great custom, I see no rhyme or reason in it. What I need is a new great custom to be introduced at once, to wit, the custom of rethinking every new situation. Brecht's intention was not realised because no music was written for He Who Says No. Brecht's intention, which was not realised because no music was written for He Who Says No, was that the two pieces should be performed back to back. They're both quite short. In terms of contemporary applied theatre practice, and in particular Bauau's Forum Theatre, here is an early instance of the theatre process being used to demonstrate a socio-political problem, leading to another piece of theatre which offers an alternative based on the discussion among the participants. Brecht, of course, is very much the playwright rather than the facilitator, but nevertheless it's not hard to see how the journey from the Lehrstück to Forum Theatre is easier and shorter than formerly supposed. The most controversial of the Lehrstücke, The Measures Taken, was performed in the same year at the Berlin Philharmonic with amateur musicians and workers' choirs who rehearsed in the evenings. Bauau's non-actors were already acting in 1930. The principal measure to which the title refers is the killing, again with his consent, of a young comrade by his fellow agitators due to his endangering of the revolution through his impetuous actions. This is reported at the beginning of the play, all subsequent action being a reported narrative from which the protagonist is necessarily absent, because he's already dead. The young comrade is impersonated by each of the four agitators in the different scenes that comprise the report. By this means, Brecht ensures that the control chorus, that's the party, like the audience, if they are not all participating in the chorus, because for some performances the intention was that anybody without a part would be part of the chorus, view the action from a narrative distance without suspense in order to assess the causes of the actions and the socio-political contexts in which they are set. When the young comrade refuses to eat with the merchant, for example, because he cannot abide his inhumanity, he loses the opportunity to purchase weapons, without which the revolution cannot be undertaken successfully. His emotional, unreasoning response attracts the following analysis from the chorus. With whom would the just man not sit to help justice? What medicine is too bitter for the man who's dying? What vileness should you not suffer to annihilate vileness? If at last you could change the world, what could make you too good to do so? Who are you? Sink in filth, embrace the butcher, but change the world. It needs it. Now, read in the light of our knowledge of Stalin's purges, the attitude is hard to stomach and is the type of moment which has encouraged Western critics to condemn Brecht as an antiquated modernist. However, such a reading is blatantly ahistorical, and historicising the action is a key component of his dramaturgy. Conservative and fascist critics in 1930 were unsurprisingly shocked and appalled by the play, and it provoked the police to open a file on all Brecht's plays. The Measures Taken was, however, also attacked vehemently in the communist press for formal aesthetic reasons, as Stephen Parker has written. In 1930, Lukács and Kurella were in the vanguard of attempts to secure agreement for a mimetic aesthetic at a time when there was no generally accepted contemporary Marxist position on literary theory. In particular, Brecht's deeply held views about the necessity of formal innovation were anathema to them. Lukács was, of course, later to prevail in the Politburo with the domination of socialist realism, consigning Brecht to the role of maverick outsider and unorthodox Marxist. Problems for communist orthodoxy did not reside, though, solely with the form of the drama, but also with its content. And so we decided we now had to cut off a member of our own body. It is a terrible thing to kill. We would not only kill others, but ourselves as well, if the need arose. For violence is the only means whereby this deadly world may be changed, as every living being knows. However, in this reenactment, the young comrade is indeed one of their own body, and so the violence is directed against the self. The young comrade stands condemned for separating reason from feeling, and in so doing, failing to think dialectically. As Müller reminds us, learning how to think dialectically is central and applies to the content, the specific Lehre, just as much as it does to the formal arrangement. The dialectical relationship between reason and feeling is located at the core of all Brecht's most important work, as well as deep within his psyche, and is responsible for many of the paradoxes and contradictions out of which he made his art. His notes on the Threepenny Opera are revealing of the tensions that operate between the individual and society. He quotes Marx's sixth thesis on Feuerbach before setting its thesis in the real world of human behaviour, where he wrote, "Today we must regard the human essence as the ensemble of all societal relations." That's Marx. The epic, this is Brecht, the epic form is the only one that can comprehend those processes that provide dramatic writing with material for a comprehensive world picture. Likewise, human beings, flesh and blood human beings, can now be comprehended only via those processes through which and in the course of which they exist. Rather than being a one-dimensional propaganda play on behalf of communism, as is the conventional Esslin-inspired reading, the Measures Taken attempts to analyse how revolutionary action can take account of the dialectical tensions whereby there can be no society without humans and no humans without society. Many of Brecht's most complex and disturbing creations, Galileo, Schweik, Azdak, Shente Shvitar, present this unresolved dialectic to their audiences. The control chorus, which may initially sound like the unchallengeable, monolithic voice of the party, ends with the sobering and all too human conclusion, taught only by reality, can reality be changed? Whereas applied theatre typically asks its participants and audiences to make immediate changes to performance texts in the act of creation, Brecht's notion is much more firmly rooted in the capacity of the text to enable learning through imitation. The constant repetition of rehearsal causes a social attitude to be implanted, and this attitude is only susceptible to change at the point where it confronts contradiction. Müller again expresses it thus: Brecht's Lehrstück experiments are centrally concerned with the relation between imitation and learning, as well as with the element of choice. The participants are called upon to copy the text and the style of acting until criticism has changed it. This point represents the juncture of Brecht's preoccupation with the subject in his dramatic theory and his emphasis on behaviour. The Lehrstück, he wrote, rests on the expectation that the actors may be socially influenced by executing certain attitudes and repeating certain speech patterns.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Who is the target? Who is seeking to be converted? Is it the audience or is it the actors?
In the phase of these Lehrstücke, he talks about abolishing the distinction between the actor and the audience. So really, it's we're really talking about participants. When he comes on later on to more conventional theatre work, then the process for the audience is to present them with disjunctions, with things that will not work in their society, and to say what you're going to do about them.
Okay. So
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because I was just trying to work out, I mean, is he seeing theatre as this tool via which to emancipate and educate external to the consciousness raising
I think he's
a community of practice, or is it a community of practice that he's seeking to enlighten via participation?
Well,
maybe, but if
I'm saying both, but that the emphasis is different at different phases in his career.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you confronted him with a choice, he would opt for the first. He would say it is a process entirely. It's to make the process of creating theatre that, if you like, that emancipatory process, to use your word.
A little bit of understanding of, say, the Soviet Film School.
Yeah.
Which was launched in 1923, I think, which was designed as a proper, not propaganda, but it's designed as a education tool.
Yeah.
To enlighten, as the masses couldn't read and write, but they could watch the cinema.
Yeah.
But this is
it's slightly different,
Yeah.
but he's undoubtedly influenced. And for example, the Blue Blouses, the famous party agitprop theatre troupe, toured quite extensively in Germany, and Brecht records responses to seeing them. So I think it would be entirely reasonable to suggest that they were influential, and those tours preceded the time I'm talking about with the Lehrstücke. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, there's a connection, definitely. No, please. Okay. Then reflecting back on this Lehrstück period, this period 1926 to 1933, from enforced exile, Brecht described his intentions as follows. And of course, when you're looking back, you can always make your intentions clearer perhaps than they were at the time. For some years, in carrying out my experiments, I tried, with a small staff of collaborators, to work outside the theatre, which, having for so long been forced to sell an evening's entertainment, had retreated into too inflexible limits for such experiments. We tried a type of theatrical performance that could influence the thinking of all the people engaged in it. We worked with different means and in different strata of society. These experiments were theatrical performances meant not so much for the spectator as for those who were engaged in the performance. It was, so to speak, art for the producer, not art for the consumer. The significance of this description of theatre for applied social change is again highlighted by Müller. The most far-reaching, she says, impact of the Lehrstück resides not in its themes, but in its structural innovation, which aims at a total abolition of the division between performance and audience. And indeed, that impact, I would suggest, reaches into the heart of contemporary applied theatre practice. Okay, then I'm going to move on to, again, as I warned you at the outset, rather selective examples from the later period of Brecht's life, when he is, first of all, in exile and then back in Berlin running his own company. So this is Parables for the Theatre. Terrible is the temptation to do good. Once Brecht was forced into exile, he was parted, of course, from any control over the means of production of his work. He therefore reverted to the role of conventional playwright, producing most of the plays which have subsequently made his reputation, but which he referred to as compromise forms and minor pedagogy. However, it would be misleading to view these plays as a complete hiatus from the Lehrstücke, since several aspects of their form and the increasing importance of dialectical dramaturgy demonstrate both the influence of the earlier plays and the evolution of Brecht's practice and theory. For example, the Caucasian Chalk Circle, written during the war, when Brecht was living in California, exhibits features that have subsequently become familiar to us from applied theatre. The prologue, set at the moment of post-war reconstruction in war-ravaged Georgia, depicts a dispute between two villages, pitting ancient rites against contemporary productivity. The story performed by the singer could be seen as an attempt to use theatre for conflict resolution, were it not for the fact that the dispute is resolved before the singer begins, his tale being more of a celebration of the decision. Nevertheless, as one of the disputants remarks, Arkady Chedze knows about our discussion. He's promised to perform something that has a bearing on the problem. Even if the paying theatre audience is a random assembly of those who can afford a ticket, the inner on-stage audience for the show is in some sense a target audience. However, perhaps because the Caucasian Chalk Circle is written to be produced in conventional theatres, the prologue has often been excluded, and Brecht had to write in defence of it to his West German publisher, Peter Suhrkamp, who wanted to remove it from the written text even before it was published. Brecht defended it thus: "Your dislike of the prologue puzzles me somewhat. It was the first bit of the play to be written by me in the States. You see, the problem posed by this parable-like play has got to be derived from real-life needs, and in my view this was achieved in a light and cheerful manner. The utopian flavour of the story, whereby some good things emerge from circumstances of terror and chaos, relates closely to the moment depicted in the prologue, which specifies the summer of 1945. Plans for European reconstruction have yet to be announced, and the historical moment is alive with the opportunity to do things differently. The detail of the stage direction shows how Brecht's awareness of what such a moment might look like, with the villagers described as mostly women and older men, for of course the young ones gave their lives at Stalingrad and elsewhere. The stories of Grusha and Azdak are parables for a post-war generation, where hope for new beginnings is tempered by the sobering recent reminders of how depraved human behaviour can be when regimes destroy social bonds. Despite the loss of control of the theatrical process, Brecht continued, as Elizabeth Wright expressed it, to seek a productive audience. She wrote, "Brecht's utopian wish was to produce an audience who would rejoice at the contradictions of a necessarily estranged world, the uncanniness of a world in flux, the constant shifting of figure and ground in a dialectical movement." Perhaps with the inclusion of participants alongside audience, this wish might well serve as a statement of intent for applied theatre, as a means of creating analyses leading to social change. The major element in this play, which connects with practices in applied theatre, is, however, the form and function of Azdak, who operates somewhat like the Joker in Forum Theatre, organising the scenes where he performs his judgments and provoking the participants with irony to review their place in the social structure. Brecht's decision to cast Ernst Busch as both the singer and Azdak in the original Berliner Ensemble production underlined this aspect. He becomes the presiding consciousness, the genial host for stories that centre on the relationship of the human instinct to preserve life, to the murderous context in which such instincts are played out. Though he is a master of irony and contradiction, this is Azdak. In Tiflis one time they hanged a landowner, a Turk, who could prove he quartered his peasants instead of merely cutting them in half as is the custom, and he squeezed twice the usual amount of taxes out of them. His zeal was above suspicion, and yet they hanged him like a common criminal because he was a Turk, a thing he couldn't do much about. What injustice! He got on the gallows by a fluke. His carnivalesque approach to life does not prevent him from performing the joker's role of forcing participants to confront contradiction. At the climax of the tale, for example, just before the test of the chalk circle, Azdak asks Groucho the questions which drive at the core of the tension between self and society, greed and goodness. He says to her, "I don't believe he's your child, but if he were yours, woman, wouldn't you want him to be rich? You'd only have to say he wasn't yours and he'd have a palace and many horses in his stables and many beggars on his doorstep and many soldiers in his service and many petitioners in his courtyard, wouldn't he? What do you say? Don't you want him to be rich?" Groucho is silent. In his introduction to Augusto Boal's The Rainbow of Desire, Adrian Jackson's description of the Joker exactly fits the function and attitude, what Brecht called Haltung, of Azdak. Jackson writes, "The Joker's function is not that of a facilitator. The Joker is, in Boal speak, a difficultator, undermining easy judgments, reinforcing our grasp of the complexity of a situation, but not letting that complexity get in the way of action or frighten us into submission or inactivity." This assessment, I think, runs uncannily close to Brecht's note on the casting of Azdak, where he wrote, "It is essential to have an actor who can portray an utterly upright man. Azdak is utterly upright, a disappointed revolutionary posing as a human wreck, like Shakespeare's wise men who act the fool. Without this, the judgment of the chalk circle would lose all its authority." Perhaps only disappointed revolutionaries are suitable to act as facilitators of applied theatre interventions. The revolutionary has the fire and the utopian vision to desire social change, but disappointment brings with it the awareness of human limitation and the likelihood of false dawns. Azdak hides in obscurity behind his mask of folly until historical circumstances contrive to thrust him into a situation where he has the chance to make an intervention, even if only temporary, into the status quo on behalf of productive human relations. Both Groucho's and Azdak's stories are conceived as social narratives, not plots woven to depict character development. The significance of the decisions they take and the ways in which they respond to their material circumstances lies in what happens in action and how these actions change the behaviour of others. For example, when Groucho and Simon, her lover, finally meet after his return from the war, Groucho is caught on the contrary impulses to declare to Simon that Michael is not hers and to affirm to the Ironshirts that he is hers. In the moment, her thoughts and feelings cannot change the situation, so these are left to the singer to articulate, with, I believe, no loss of empathy at all. There was yearning, but there was no waiting. The oath is broken. Neither could say why. Hear what she thought but did not say. While you fought in the battle, soldier, the bloody battle, the bitter battle, I found a helpless infant. I had not the heart to destroy him. I had to care for a creature that was lost. I had to stoop for breadcrumbs on the floor. I had to break myself for that which was not mine, that which was other people's. It is the social usefulness of the action that counts, rather than the light it might shed upon the character. For this, like applied theatre, is an art directed towards social change, however utopian the aspiration. In assessing Azdak's motives for the climactic decision he makes about the award of custody, Ronald Spears articulates the criteria in play. He writes, "For Azdak, the past therefore carries weight only inasmuch as it is relevant to the future. He does not decide which woman has the better right to possess the child, but bases his judgment on the child's right to a good mother, and so grants Groucho the privilege of bearing the responsibility for Michael's further upbringing," taking us, of course, right back to the prologue's discussion. Both stories are propelled by senseless acts of kindness. taking place at about the same moment in time, though not in the narrative structure of the play. Groucho's taking up of the abandoned baby is presented as slowly and carefully as Asdaq's failure to turn the fugitive Grand Duke over to the police is treated rapidly and understatedly. The dangers of being good have already been demonstrated in Groucho's case. The singer articulates the crisis of being human in a violent world, not structured around the needs of ordinary people. As she was standing between courtyard and gate, she heard or thought she heard a low voice calling. The child called to her, not whining, but calling quite sensibly, or so it seemed to her. "Woman," it said, "help me." And it went on, not whining, but saying quite sensibly, "No, woman, he who hears not a cry for help but passes by with troubled ears will never hear the gentle call of a lover, nor the blackbird at dawn, nor the happy sigh of the tired grate picker as the Angelus rings." She walks a few steps towards the child and bends over it. Hearing this, she went back for one more look at the child, only to sit with him for a moment or two, only till someone should come, his mother or anyone. Leaning on a trunk, she sits facing the child. Only till she would have to leave, for the danger was too great. The city was full of flame and crying. The light grows dimmer, as though evening and night were coming on. Fearful is the seductive power of goodness. Groucho now settles down to watch over the child through the night. Once she lights a small lamp to look at it. Once she tucks it in with a coat. From time to time she listens and looks to see whether someone is coming. And she sat with the child a long time, till evening came, till night came, till dawn came. She sat too long. Too long she saw the soft breathing, the small clenched fists, till toward morning the seduction was complete, and she rose and bent down and, sighing, took the child and carried it away. As if it was stolen goods, she picked it up. As if she was a thief, she crept away. And this the playwright who banished empathy from the theatre. Frederick Jameson captures something of the force of the moment by relating individual human capacity to the tidal movements of history in his book Brechtian Method. He writes, "Suddenly, Brecht's luminous verse reverses all that ancient tradition of sin and human nature. Now it is goodness itself which exerts the baleful force of temptation, which mesmerizes Groucho and is on the point of leading her to do things very much against her own best interests and personal safety. Now the cooperative ideal exerts all the uncanny power of attraction that used to be attributed to vice. And it is the good instincts which seem to have been only momentarily repressed by the process of civilization and are ready to break out again at the slightest pretext." However, at no point in the narrative does Brecht underestimate what goodness is up against or the magnitude of making any structural change to society. Not only does the production aesthetic constantly remind us that we are watching a piece of theatre, albeit one grounded in the principle taught only by reality, can reality be changed? But the ending of the fable stresses the brevity and limits of Asdaq's intervention. And after that evening, Asdaq vanished and was never seen again. The people of Grushinia did not forget him, but long remembered the period of his judging as a brief golden age, almost an age of justice. Theatre, applied or otherwise, cannot bring about a state of justice or a just state. Absolute values such as justice form part of the crock of gold at the end of the utopian rainbow, constantly to be sought, though never to be found. In his essay From Epic to Dialectical Theatre 2, written around 1954, Brecht signals to the dialectical, and, centrally, it is the function of the audience which motivates this change. So that the particularity of situations and behaviour that the theatre presents may emerge and be criticised in a playful manner, the audience creates in its mind additional situations and ways of behaving, and while still following the plot, compares them to what the theatre presents. In this way, the audience itself is transformed into a storyteller. If we keep this in mind, and emphatically add that the audience as co-inventor must be able to take the standpoint of that part of society that is the most productive, most impatient and most insistent on positive change, we may from now on stop using the term epic theatre for the theatre that we mean. This term has proven its usefulness if the narrative element that is part of all theatre has been strengthened and enriched. With the substitution perhaps of participant for audience, these words come close to a depiction of applied theatre practice. The facilitator, playwright, dramaturg creates the frame into which the creativity of the audience participant can be woven in the form of the stories being offered. Brecht gives increasing emphasis towards the end of his life upon playfulness, a concept which not only served to remind the audience that it is watching actors at play, and play is flexible, changeable, rich with alternatives, but also that the manner of playing is light, ironic, and prone to paradox, with the actor constantly treating the character with a twinkling, critical scepticism. In Brecht's mind, there's a clear and powerful link between dialectics and the manner in which social reality is represented in the theatre. In paragraph 45 of A Short Organum for the Theatre, he wrote, "This technique allows the theatre to make use in its representations of the new social scientific method known as dialectical materialism. In order to unearth society's laws of motion, this method treats social situations as processes and traces out all their inconsistencies. It regards nothing as existing except insofar as it changes. In other words, is in disharmony with itself. This also goes for those human feelings, opinions, and attitudes through which, at any time, the form of men's, life together finds its expression." When Brecht came to write his appendices to the Short Organum, he returned to paragraph 45, not to revise his earlier opinion, but rather to emphasize the importance of playfulness and to assert the centrality of dialectics to the business of living. He wrote, "The theatre of the scientific age is in a position to make dialectics into a source of enjoyment. The unexpectedness of logically progressive or zigzag development, the instability of every circumstance, the joke of contradiction, and so forth. All these are ways of enjoying the liveliness of men, things, and processes, and they heighten both our capacity for life and our pleasure in it." As so often with Brecht, these theoretical comments come after some practical experience in the theatre. In the case of this emphasis on dialectics, the good person of Setz I is the principal attempt at achieving a dialectical dramaturgy. While every scene contains its own set of ironies, paradoxes and contradictions, the principal shaping contradiction, following Mao Zedong's essay on contradiction, which Brecht had read earlier, is that between morality and business. The effectiveness of the play resides in the dialectical relationship of morality to profit. It is the unsustainable situation of Shen Te, the angel of the slums, which produces her cousin Shui Ta, the unscrupulous but highly successful businessman. The theatrical coup is to locate this dialectical process within the single character, thereby replacing any tendency to create binary opposition with the awareness that this is a process located at the core of all our beings. Every one of us can tell a story to illustrate how this dialectical struggle plays out in our own lives. The parable is not offered, as in the Caucasian chalk circle, as a way of resolving contradiction, but rather as a way of heightening it. The standoff between Shen Te and the gods is maintained beyond the conclusion of the story. Shen Te, "But I need my cousin." First god, "Not too often." Shen Te, "At least once a week." First god, "Once a month, that's enough." The cheerful irreverence of the epilogue cannot disguise its significance in signalling to the audience the requirement that they take up the role of co-inventor in the world beyond the theatre. How could a better ending be arranged? Could one change people? Can the world be changed? Would new gods do the trick? Will atheism, moral rearmament, materialism? It is for you to find a way, my friends, to help good men arrive at happy ends. You write the happy ending to the play. There's got to be a way. And here again is a core element of applied theatre, first trialled in the work of Brecht. The liberating, as opposed to the domesticating model of applied theatre, is to tell a story structured around contradiction and to offer that contradiction up to the participants, spectators or audience, for them to tackle in their own situations. Not so that all problems are solved, but rather so that in the practical analysis of contradiction, alternatives may arise possibilities emerge, and tentative steps along the rocky path to utopia may be taken. We're nearly there. Brecht and Boal rehearsing the revolution. The purpose of this analysis is not to denigrate the theory and practice of Boal, who acknowledges his debt to Brecht in Theatre of the Oppressed, but rather to suggest that some of Boal's reflections on Brecht have misrepresented him and perhaps led to Brecht becoming somewhat marginalised when seminal influences on applied theatre are being considered. In carving out his own aesthetic of activist theatre, Boal laid claim to a ground which was not as devoid of predecessors as the reader of Theatre of the Oppressed might suppose. We've seen already how complex the operation of empathy can be in Brecht's dramaturgy, so that Boal's reductionist view strikes something of a false note, where he wrote, "The only indispensable element in empathy is that the spectator assumes a passive attitude, delegating his ability to act." Brecht's use of empathy would suggest rather that the indispensable element is the drawing of the spectator into making an emotional commitment to the story, out of which responses, be they passive or active, can emerge. Boal's comment on Mother Courage, I think, is instructive here. He wrote, "How can one fail to be moved when Mother Courage loses her sons, one by one, in the war? Inevitably, the spectator is moved to tears. But the emotion caused by ignorance must be avoided. Let no one weep over the fate that took Mother Courage's sons from her. Let one cry with anger against war and against the commerce of war, because it is this commerce that takes away the sons of Mother Courage." This analysis, I think, is too simple on several levels. Brecht creates unique situations around the deaths of each child, and incidentally, why does Boal not include Katrine in his list? So that the audience experiences a more complex set of emotions. Courage has to disown the body of Swiss cheese laid out in front of her. Eilif's death, if death it be, happens far away, while Katrine is shot, while Courage is busy doing business elsewhere. Brecht is indeed concerned to take our responses straight past pity and onto anger, but that anger is itself only a prelude to a consideration of the contradictions caused by trying to profit from the violence of an irrational world. Contradictions located not only in Mother Courage, not only in the world between 1939 and 1945, not only in contemporary geopolitics, but critically in each one of us. Empathy is a set of stepping stones leading across murky waters to what lies close to the core values of humanity. The key difference that Boal asserts between his own and Brecht's poetics concerns the autonomy of the spectator. He writes, "Brecht proposes a poetics in which the spectator delegates power to the character, who thus acts in his place, but the spectator reserves the right to think for himself, often in opposition to the character." While this notion is patently untrue for the poetics of the Lehrstücke, where the distinction between actor and audience has been abolished, it does not hold for the later compromise forms either. Had Boal declared that power was delegated to the actor, a case might be made out. But the character, presented with the distance of irony to a critical spectator, exerts no such force. Lurking beneath Boal's response to Brecht, I think, is a binary notion of either empathizing with or being in opposition to a character. In Brecht's theatre, the main protagonists always enter into more complex relations with their societies than a binary analysis can hold. The beguiling simplicity of forum theatre, which has led to its universal application in applied theatre, derives from the manner in which Boal first presented it in the Theatre of the Oppressed. Having begun the scene, the actors develop it to the point at which the main problem reaches a crisis and needs a solution. Then the actors stop the performance and ask the audience to offer solutions. They improvise immediately all the suggested solutions, and the audience has the right to intervene to correct the actions or words of the actors, who are obliged to comply strictly with these instructions from the audience. The language of problem and solution, allied to the demand for immediate improvisation, creates a quick fix poetics that can only address a very limited area of social reality. And this tendency has been exacerbated since Boal's death by the subsequent diktats of CTO Rio, insisting that only the oppressed person in any given scenario can be replaced by a spectator. Forum theatre has created a space where an audience member can enter the action, but as actor or as character. but the nature of that action is fiercely circumscribed by the aesthetic frame. The only possibility for complicating the action in line with reality resides in the person of the joker. I've written elsewhere on applied theatre's debt to the tradition of the fool in European theatre. Rush out and purchase it. Here let it suffice to consider how closely aspects of Boal's Joker resemble some of Brecht's creations, most notably as Dak. Boal wrote, "We propose a Joker who is a contemporary and neighbour of the spectator. For this it is necessary to restrict his explanations. It is necessary to move him away from the other characters, to bring him closer to the spectators." The combined figure of the singer and Azdak works in just the way proposed here. We have seen how sparely the singer presents the inner life of Groucho and Simon, while Azdak's life is all outer, the explanation being the action. Once again, Boal's application of the figure seems too schematic to match the multivalent complexities of social reality. He wrote, "Within this system, the explanations given periodically are designed to make the performance develop on two different and complementary levels. That of the fable, which can use all the conventional imaginative resources of the theatre, and that of the lecture, in which the joker becomes an exegete." Brecht's jokers move in and out of the fable with a fluidity that cannot be encompassed by levels, and tendencies to lecture the audience are compromised constantly by irony and contradiction. At bottom, the difference between Brecht and Boal lies in their notion of what theatre can achieve. Where Boal declares that theatre is a rehearsal of revolution, Brecht's theatre is directed towards social analyses of the ways in which the world might be changed, which take account of social reality. Applying Brechtian theatre, just a small conclusion. In his poem Speech to Danish Working Class Actors on the Art of Observation, Brecht instructs his listeners that the first thing you have to learn is the art of observation, because the basis of applying theatre to the society in which we live is to create it from the observed reality of daily life. If the actor does this by learning to observe, the non-actor does it by dramatising the story of her lived experience. Brecht's theatre aesthetic is geared towards enabling the actors, of whatever kind, to see better in order that reality may be more truly represented. The Verfremdungseffect was developed for just this reason. By defamiliarising the everyday, the taken for granted, it can be subjected to more intense scrutiny until its underlying significance surfaces. However, this close observation is only phase one, taught only by reality. The second phase concerns changing that reality. Here, interventionist thinking, eingreifendes Denken, to use his phrase, is necessary. Having observed the deep structures of social reality, the observer then looks to see how she might make an intervention that could be effective in the cause of change. The relationship is, as ever, dialectical. If the intervention does not arise from the real, it will be worthless and unsustainable. And if the observation does not lead to intervention, it will be merely an academic indulgence. A clue towards how this dialectic might be worked out in life is offered by Brecht's increasing use of the concept of the naive, which links playfulness with observation with intervention. Peter Brooker puts it thus: "The naive, therefore, fittingly joined together contraries. It was a look, a posture, an attitude of mind. It implied an intelligent simplicity, innocence and shrewdness, joining the conceptual and concrete, the popular and philosophical. A naive attitude would estrange the familiar and problematize the self-evident, signalling a dialectical movement from the ordinary and everyday to the original and innovatory." It was thus, in short, a summary jest of Brecht's transformative utopian perspective upon art and life. Shortly before Brecht's death in 1956, Manfred Weckwerth, his successor director at the Berliner Ensemble, asked him which of his plays represented the theatre of the future. Brecht replied, "Die Maßnahme," the measures taken. Applied theatre practitioners with sufficient humility might reflect on how right he was. Thank you.